Welcome to Life of Christ. Today we're going to look at a particular and spectacular event in the life of our Lord. We are looking at the life of Christ through the eyes of Luke. In his gospel, he is presenting the Son of God who offers salvation to all. We're going to look at the Transfiguration of Christ in Luke 9:22-36. That very spectacular event of Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, as it became known, where the glory of Jesus' deity flashed through his flesh. What Jesus was teaching his disciples was, he just told them he's going to the cross to suffer and die. But then he reminds them that glory follows suffering. And in the life of Christ, the kingdom will follow the cross. The suffering of Jesus on the cross will precede the coming glory of the kingdom. And he's teaching us a lesson that in his present life there is suffering, but in the future life there will be glory. There will be great delight in the Lord. When I was thinking on this subject, I was reminded of a great hymnist, Fanny Crosby. She wrote 8,000 hymns, and we sing many of those today. Those hymns have great theology. One of the reasons I appreciate the sovereign grace music movement is they are writing new hymns because they know the value of the theology in those hymns. We know there can be good theology in contemporary music as well. But the reason behind hymns like Christ Alone is to give that theology. And Fanny Crosby was a Bible student, and her hymns are full of theology. When she was 6 weeks old, she had a cold and all the congestion and stuff that went with it. But her doctor put on her eyes a common remedy of that day, a mustard plaster, it was called. And it resulted in her blindness. She was blind for the rest of her 95 years. Her biographer, Annie Willis, said, had she not been blind, she would not have gotten this education that she did. But with that education, it equipped her to write all those hymns and many poems as well. When Fanny Crosby was only 8 years old, she wrote her first hymn. Fanny Crosby wrote, "It seemed intended by the blessed providence of God that I should be blind all my life, and I thank him for the dispensation." That's why she called her blindness a stewardship that God gave to her to use. She saw it as the hand of God. She also wrote this, "If perfect sight were offered me tomorrow, I would not accept it." Here's this woman, blind all her life, but she could see that this would result in great glory in the future. She also wrote, "When I get to heaven, the first face that shall ever gladden my sight will be that of my Savior." She wrote hymns like, "Blessed Assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine." She understood this great verse, Romans 8:18, "For I consider true that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be in us." We need the attitude of Fanny Crosby. We need what Jesus in his transfiguration exemplified for us. Here's the outline of Luke. We'll see how all this fits in together. The purpose, of course, is to win Theophilus to the Lord. Then you have the birth and childhood of Jesus. He was virgin born. He was the Son of God. That's important for Theophilus to know. Then you have the preparation of Jesus' ministry. He was baptized. His his ministry in Galilee, rejected. But then he started performing these authenticating miracles that proved that the one they rejected was the Son of God. 6 confrontations by the Pharisees, the scribes, the religionists of his day. And then he calls his 12 apostles, perhaps as a result of these confrontations, this intense antagonism. And then as a part of equipping them, he preached to them the Sermon on the Mount. And what we're going to look at today is the preview of the kingdom in Jesus' transfiguration. This led to Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. A turning point in Luke is in chapter 9, verse 51, if you want to look at that. And it came to pass, when the time was come, that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. And we know at Jerusalem, he will be crucified, he will be buried, he will be resurrected. We're going to focus now on the coming glory and the present suffering. What we learn first is suffering precedes glory. Look in chapter 9, verse 22. Saying, this is Jesus speaking now, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be slain and be raised the third day. Suffering is going to precede glory. If you look ahead to verse 26, you'll see the word glory. In verse 22, I underlined suffer. In verse 26, I underlined glory. Verse 26, for whosoever shall be ashamed of me and my words of him, shall the Son of Man be ashamed when he shall come in his own glory. In his first coming, Jesus suffered. In his second coming, he will return with great glory. Jesus predicts his suffering and resurrection in verse 22. We'll go back there. Jesus said, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and scribes, chief priests, and be slain. Let's focus on that just a minute. Be slain and be raised. If we go to chapter 23, we can look ahead here, where Luke records the fulfillment of what Jesus just said. In Luke 23, I'm going to look at verse 26. Luke 23, 26. And as they led him away, that is Jesus, they laid upon one Simon a Cyrenian coming out of the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it for Jesus. So they're on the way to the cross. And then verse 33, and when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him. And on either side was one of the thieves. Verse 34 is one of those 7 sayings from the cross. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And then verse 43, the 2 thieves hanging, one on each side of Jesus, one rejected Christ, one received Christ. Verse 43, and Jesus said unto him, verily I say unto you, today you shall be with me in paradise. What a scene. Jesus dying for the sins of the world, and he wins one of those sinners to himself as they died together. Verse 46, and when Jesus cried with a loud voice, he said, the last saying from the cross, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. But look at the impact on someone else at the cross in verse 47. Now when the centurion saw what was done, he glorified God and said, this is a Roman centurion, certainly this was a righteous man. Jesus said, I'm going to the cross to suffer. But he also said he's going to be resurrected, and Luke records that in chapter 24, verse 1. Now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they, that is the women, who were coming to prepare Jesus' body for burial, when they got there, they saw the stone rolled away from the sepulchre, verse 2. They enter, verse 3. Verse 4, and it came to pass as they were much perplexed thereabout, behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments. Of course, those are angels. And they told them that the Son of Man had been resurrected. The dying thief became a believer. The centurion was impressed, influenced by the death of Christ. And now in his resurrection, the angels speak first to the women, not men. Jesus later will appear to the women first before men. And this is in a society where basically women are second-class citizens. But everywhere Christianity goes, it elevates the status of women. Jesus predicted his suffering and his resurrection, and it came to pass. But let's go back to chapter 9. Following that prediction by Christ, then he addressed his disciples, beginning in verse 23. And he said to them all, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Jesus' teaching, suffering precedes glory, not only for him, but for his followers. And the cross was a very ugly symbol of shame and reproach. No Roman could be crucified. Crucifixion was not talked about in proper conversation. It was an emblem of rejection and stigma. Warren Wiersbe said, no one would have thought about wearing a gold cross around their neck. It would be like someone wearing a gold electric chair around their neck today, because it was such a symbol of reproach. But what is Jesus saying? When you bear your cross, you are identifying with me, what the world considers a shameful death. The Apostle Paul, if you want to put a reference down, 1 Corinthians 15:31 said, I die daily. By that he meant, in that resurrection chapter, because I teach and preach the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Every day I wake up with the possibility, this day, I may die for my faith. Suffering precedes glory. But then glory follows suffering. Let's go back to verse 26. And whosoever, Jesus said, shall be ashamed of me, and my words of him shall the Son of Man be ashamed, when he shall come in his own glory. This is talking about the end time events when Jesus will return. And Luke elaborated on that. Luke elaborated on the sufferings of Christ and his crucifixion. He elaborated on the resurrection of Christ. And now he will elaborate on this prediction of Jesus that he will come in glory. And this is in Luke 21. This is called his Sermon on the Mount of Olives. This is where he predicts the future. Let's start with verse 25. And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth's distress of nations, with perplexity and the sea and the waves roaring. So what Jesus says here in a brief statement, the whole book of Revelation, beginning in chapter 4 to chapter 18, elaborates on. This is end time events. Look in verse 27. And then, what he described in verse 25 is the tribulation period. What? Revelation chapter 4 to chapter 18 elaborates on the 7-year tribulation following the rapture of the church. Comes these years of tribulation, 7 years of tribulation, and then Jesus' second coming to earth in glory. Verse 27, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Let's go back to that Transfiguration chapter. What did he predict? What did Jesus predict in 9:22? He would suffer in his first coming. What did he predict in verse 26? That he would come back in glory. And this, as Luke records and tells us, that when he comes the second time, it will be in glory, and it will be followed by the kingdom. Excuse me. Look in verse 27 now. Luke 9:27. Jesus continuing. But I tell you of a truth, there be some standing here which shall not taste death till they see the kingdom of God. How Jesus will fulfill this will be in his transfiguration, when the glory of his deity will flash through his flesh, and some of those 12 disciples that are standing there with him, Peter, James, and John, will see this preview of the coming kingdom. Let me outline it like this, okay? There's Jesus suffering. Luke 9:22 on the cross. We're living after the cross. We're living before the rapture. At the rapture, as Paul teaches in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, we will be caught up, meet the Lord in the air. There will be 7 years of tribulation that we just saw Jesus refer to. Then he returns to earth and he comes in glory. That's what Jesus was saying. This is followed by the kingdom. You can see how what Jesus said is chronological. This is elaborated on in Revelation chapter 4 to chapter 19. That's the second coming of Christ. Revelation 20, the kingdom. We learn in Revelation 20 this is 1,000 years long. That's the picture. That's what Jesus is going to preview. The transfiguration of Christ previewed the glory of Christ's second coming. Look in verse 26 again. In the verse, he shall come in his own glory. What is glory? What is glory? Glory is the manifestation of Jesus' deity. This is what Jesus had before he was incarnate. I'm going to go to John 17. This is Jesus' prayer the night before his crucifixion. Listen, this is Jesus talking to God the Father. Verse 5. Let's drop down to verse 5. John 17:5. Now, Father, glorify me with your own self, with the glory which I had with you before the world was. In other words, this is that brilliant shining. I'm going to go to Hebrews 1. There it's referred to. Verse 3, Hebrews 1:3. Who being, referring to Christ, who being in the brightness of his glory. Verse 3 refers to Jesus who made the worlds or the ages. Before there was any creation, what was Jesus like? Verse 3, who being the brightness of his glory. But when he came to earth, he did not so much give up that glory, but he veiled that glory in his flesh. This is Hebrews 10. If you're still in Hebrews 10 and verse 20. Hebrews 10:20. Verse 19 says, having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter into the holiness by the blood of Christ, that is through prayer, go into the presence of God, by a new and living way, which he, Christ, has consecrated for us through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. That flesh veiled the glory of Christ. But on the Mount of Transfiguration, that glory became evident. We call this the Transfiguration of Christ. Luke does not use that word, but I'm going to go back to Matthew's parallel account in Matthew 17. Matthew actually uses the word transfiguration. So this is Matthew 17, verse 1, and after 6 days. Let me back up to verse 28 at the end of chapter 16. You can see the parallel accounts here. Matthew's writing about it. Luke's writing about it. They add their own unique details. Verse 28, verily I say unto you, Luke 16:28, there be some standing here which shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. He's not talking about, he's not saying some of you standing here are going to see the kingdom set up. No, that was postponed. But they're going to get a preview of it. Chapter 17:1 now in Matthew. And after 6 days, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John. Those are the ones standing there who got this preview. His brother brings them up into an high mountain apart and was, you see that next word? Matthew 17:2, transfigured. The English word that we get from the Greek word is metamorphosis or metamorphosized. When you think of metamorphosis, I think of that ugly caterpillar coming out of that cocoon as a beautiful monarch butterfly. It was transfigured. It became beautiful. Well, that's what happened for a brief moment on the Mount of Transfiguration. The glory of Christ just transfigured him. Looking back in Luke 9 now, verse 28, and it came to pass about 8 days after this saying that some of you will see a preview of the kingdom. He took Peter, James, and John, went up into a mountain to pray, and as he prayed, the fashion of his countenance was altered. The other gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, say it was like lightning flashing. And his raiment was white and glistering. He was transformed. We think about the humility of Christ. Philippians chapter 2, Jesus surrendered, or it says he emptied himself in Philippians 2. But empty it doesn't mean that he gave up something. It actually means instead of subtraction, he added. He emptied himself. And then the very next statement in Philippians 2, verse 6 says, and he added the essence of a servant. Humanity was joined to deity. No attributes were surrendered. He didn't empty himself of attributes. He really didn't even empty himself of glory. He just allowed his flesh to veil it the majority of the time, except for this one grand exception. The Transfiguration of Christ previewed the glory of Christ at his second coming. And then the Transfiguration of Christ previewed who will be in the kingdom. We've already read three people with Jesus on the mount, Peter, James, and John. But look in verse 30. And behold, there talked with him 2 men who were Moses and Elijah. It seems to be, some people believe, that these different people with Jesus when he's previewing the kingdom gives us a preview of who is going to be in the kingdom. You have Peter, James, and John. Let me back up here. Let me back up a little bit to right here. The church is raptured here, leaving unsaved people on the earth, but a number so great that no man can number, Revelation 7, are converted. And then when Jesus comes back at the second coming, those who are believers, they're going to walk right into the kingdom in their natural bodies. There'll be believing Jews who go into the kingdom in their natural bodies. There'll be Gentiles who believe, they'll go into the kingdom in their natural bodies. That's who Peter, James, and John are representing. But then you're going to have these Old Testament saints. Let's go back here. Old Testament saints who are going to be in the kingdom. Moses represents those who died in the Old Testament, were resurrected right here. The church is resurrected here, and living believers are raptured up. Old Testament saints are resurrected here, and like Moses, Old Testament saints who died will go into the kingdom. But there are some, like Elijah, who did not die. He was ushered into the presence of God. That seems to picture those who at the rapture will be caught up to heaven. We come back with Christ here, and we're in the kingdom, and we never died. We are the exception to the rule. It is appointed unto men once to die. That seems to be what is being pictured here. Who will be in the kingdom? Sometimes I'm asked this question. Perhaps you've asked this question or been asked this question. Will we recognize one another in heaven? When that question is asked me, I go right here to the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter, James, and John recognized Moses and Elijah, whom they had never met before. I'm looking forward to seeing Jesus like Fanny Crosby, right? Except for her, the first face she ever saw was the face of Jesus. But we're going to recognize loved ones, friends. I'm going to recognize my grandmother. I'm going to recognize my dad who passed away. I'm going to recognize one of my best friends, Jack Lemons. We will recognize one another, I think, based on what happened here. And then, lastly, the Transfiguration of Christ previewed what we will do in the kingdom. Look in verse 31. Who appeared in glory, Moses and Elijah appeared in glory and spoke of his decease, spoke of Jesus' death. That word in the Greek is exodos, from which we get our English word exodus, the Exodus. Moses led an exodus, but Moses and Elijah didn't speak about Moses' exodus, but rather Jesus' exodus. Moses led Israel out of Egypt, delivered them from physical bondage. But Jesus, in his death, in his exodus, delivers us from the bondage of sin. That's what they are talking about, the death of Christ, the deliverance that will be accomplished, as verse 31 says, in Jerusalem. But Peter, verse 32, but Peter and they that were with him were heavy with sleep. And when they were awake, they saw his glory. That's that manifestation of deity coming through his flesh. And the two men stood with him. And it came to pass, verse 33, as Peter departed, as they, Moses and Elijah, departed from him, from Christ, Peter said unto Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us build 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And then Luke adds that Peter really did not know what he was talking about, or maybe the significance of it. We don't want to do what Peter did. We don't want to exalt man. Somebody said this was the greatest Bible conference ever. You had three great preachers. You had Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. preaching on one of the greatest subjects, the death of Christ, the deliverance that the death of Christ brings. And Peter wanted to exalt, but on the same level with Jesus, the other two preachers. Sometimes, again, I'm asked a question, who's your favorite preacher? My answer always is, I don't have a favorite preacher. I have preachers I really enjoy listening to, but I am not, as the Corinthians were, of Paul or Peter. I don't want to exalt a man over the Lord Jesus. What will we do? Well, we'll do what God the Father did here on the Mount of Transfiguration. We will exalt his Son throughout the kingdom. Verse 34, while Peter was speaking, there came a cloud and overshadowed them, and they feared as they entered into the cloud. And there came a voice out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." We want to hear what Jesus says. Thank God for good preachers. Thank God for good Bible teachers. But we want to hear what Jesus, the Son of God, says to us through those preachers, those teachers. We want to exalt Christ. I think we have a great lesson here, a great principle. This life is characterized by suffering when we identify with the ignoble, the reproachful death, crucifixion of Christ. There will be suffering. But as Paul said, I count it to be true that the sufferings of this present world are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. We're going to look at next the transfiguration of the disciples. First, the transfiguration of Christ, and then the transfiguration of the disciples.